Hello, Econ students. We are going to start Unit 2, Macroeconomics. Actually, this is macro measures, but we're now going to talk about macroeconomics. Just to remind you, macro is the study of the large economy as a whole. We're studying the big picture of the country's economy. The reason why macroeconomics happened was because of the Great Depression in the 30s. Lots of bad things, high unemployment, 25% unemployment. People sat around and said, maybe we should figure out a way to not let this happen again. So macroeconomics was born, and we study it to measure the health of the whole economy and also to guide government policies so that we can fix problems and not have something bad like the Great Depression happen again. So, for all economies, there are three major economic goals. Number one, we want to promote growth. Number two, we want to limit unemployment. And number three, we want to limit inflation. This unit, we're going to analyze how all three of those things are measured. In this video, we're just going to look at GDP. So, number one goal is promoting economic growth. So, how does a country measure economic growth? How do we know how well we're doing in the economy? Basically, there's a bunch of economists and accountants that sit around and collect statistics and count numbers. They count how many things are produced, they count income, they count investment, they count savings. All of that umbrella is called national income accounting. But the one we're going to focus on in terms of economic growth is GDP. The most important measure of growth is GDP, gross domestic product, which is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in 1 year. So if we break down the pieces of this definition, it makes a little more sense and it'll help you understand what we're doing when we start talking about GDP in more depth. So GDP again is the dollar value. What that means is that GDP is measured in dollars or in the country's currency, depending on which country you're talking about. It's also final goods. GDP does not include the value of intermediate goods, things that go in to make an item. It only counts the things that have been produced and the final thing that's been produced. The in, part of within, is just to remind you that we're only counting things that were produced inside the country. In order for it to be in the United States' GDP, it has to be made inside the US. And then the last thing, 1 year. We're just measuring and counting what was produced in 1 year annually. So what's the point of counting everything that's been produced? We use that number. We take the dollar value of everything that's been produced. We use that number like our income or a country's income. GDP measures how well the US is doing financially. So people will say, oh, I make this such and such amount a year. In GDP, it's kind of the same thing. We've produced this dollar value of all of these items this year, and we can use it from one country to the next to see who's made more and who's doing better off. So, what do we use GDP for? Three main things. One, to compare to previous years. Number one goal of the economy is to promote growth. How do we know we grow? We take the GDPs from year to year and see if the numbers are bigger. Two, compare policy changes. Did a policy work? Is what Trump doing right now working? Or what Obama did in the past, did it work? And we see what's working, what's not working, and try to go from there. And then three, compare to other countries. Are we better off? So if we just focus on measuring growth, we can figure out percent change in GDP with this formula. So percent change in GDP is going to equal year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1 times 100. This formula works for any percent change of anything, but if we're just looking at GDP, let's look at this example. So Mortar's GDP in 2017 was 4,000, and in 2018 it was 5,000. What's the percent change in GDP? How much did it increase or decrease? So we plug these numbers into the formula. So year 2 is the 5,000 minus year 1, 4,000, divided by year 1, which is 4,000, times 100. So 5,000 minus 4,000 is 1,000, divided by 4,000, times 100. This is going to be 0.25 times 100. It equals 25%. So what we're saying is that mortar's GDP went up by 25%, which is a huge gain. All right. Make sure you have that formula written down in your notes. All right. The last thing that we use GDP for, the number 3 thing, it said, are we better off than another country? We can use GDP to answer that question, but we have to adjust it a little. And it focuses on standard of living. So standard of living can be measured in part by how well the economy is doing, but it needs to be adjusted to reflect the size of the population. So the United States has a really large GDP number, so does China, so does India. But if we, and if you compare that to a small country like Moldova, their number is going to be very small. But you can't say that Moldova is not better off than us or not the same as us because they're doing very well. So how do you compare from one country to another? You've got to put in the per person. So GDP per capita or per person is GDP divided by the population. This identifies on average how many products each person makes. GDP per capita is the best measure of the nation's standard of living. So how can you tell whether a country has a high standard of living? They have running water, they have computers, they have cars, all these things that show that a country is well off per capita. You've got to divide it by per capita because the smaller countries in Europe or some other areas, they're going to have high GDP if you divide it by the per person because they have less people living in them. So make sure you add in per person. And then the final thing we're going to talk about today is what is not included in GDP. So make sure these are in your notes. So these are things that do not count into GDP. Remember, GDP is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in 1 year. These things are often mistaken and put in GDP, and we need to make sure that they're not. So number 1 is intermediate goods. These are goods inside final goods that don't count. For example, the price of a finished Apple phone is part of GDP, but we don't include the price of those earbuds that are included. Now, if you go and buy earbuds later by themselves because you lost yours or whatever, that's fine. But the ones that are included in the box with the original Apple phone, that doesn't count as production because it's a part of the final good of the Apple phone. Second thing is non-production transactions. Those are financial transactions where nothing has been produced. Stocks and bonds is basically the example of that. You're selling and buying ownership of an item, but you're not producing anything. And remember, GDP is gross domestic product. How much have we produced? And also used goods. Old cars, used clothes, used textbooks. Anything that was made in the previous year does not count in the current year's GDP because it was already counted before. And the last thing is 3, non-market or illegal activities. These are things that are made at home or made outside of the market and there's nobody counting it because it's illegal. So if your mom cuts your hair, even if you pay her some money, it doesn't matter, it's not part of GDP. And the people that sell candy on campus, that's part of the black market, doesn't count in GDP. Drugs and illegal activities as well. Okay, so that is it for part 1. We'll get to part 2 later. Thank you.